Good morning, and welcome to this DGCOM Innovation Talk on how to mobilize young voters. My name is Hannah Maas. I work in the Youth Outreach Unit of DGCOM. And with me today to talk about this, or honestly, to do the main talking about how to mobilize young voters, is Stevie Valles, who has a long history of empowering young people through participation in the democratic process, kind of rooted in work on education, voting, advocacy, accountability. He's worked for the United States Senate, the Texas legislature, and campaigns ranging from presidential to affordable housing, kind of the whole gamut. But today, he is here in his role as one of the executive directors of Chicago Votes, a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization building a more inclusive democracy by putting power in the hands of young people from Chicago. Welcome, Stevie. I'm really glad you made it all the way from Chicago.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
All right. I have a couple of housekeeping announcements before we start. You're all used to this by now, but just in case it's your first DGCOM Innovation Talk, ask your questions on Slido. The code is #DGCOM. I think we can blend that in on screen. If not, you should be able to remember. Oh, there we go. DGCOM, you can also just scan it with your phone from your screen. So you can ask your questions. You can also upvote other questions. So if there's like a question that you see that you really like, just give it a like, and we'll get to them more in the second half of this innovation talk. To see if the Slido is working, I have a super simple warm-up question for you, and that question is: have you been to Chicago? Just for Stevie to get an understanding of how much he needs to sell the touristic angle here as well. And while you are filling in this poll, a quick mandated data protection announcement, just for you to know. Of course, the session is recorded. As always, it will be available on demand afterwards. It will also be shared with Stevie and Stevie's colleagues in the US. So again, for you to know if you decide to ask a question. All right, let's get going. Actually, I'll see about 75% of people watching have not yet been to Chicago.
Oh, wow.
So
you got to come visit.
Yeah. I recently started watching the show The Bear, which is in Chicago.
Yeah.
Well, in a restaurant in Chicago.
Right. More. Italian beef.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Look good.
It's good. Yeah.
I would like to visit now. But perhaps, again, you're not here to talk about the wonders of Chicago, but about how to mobilize young voters. So I think my first question to you would be, what is Chicago Votes? How did it come to be? What's its focus? What does it do?
Yeah, so Chicago Votes, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, obviously based in Chicago, Illinois. We started actually 10 years ago. We just turned 10 in late June. We celebrated our 10-year birthday. Thank you. We threw a big party. Wish you all could have been there. But we started because young people weren't participating in the political process or the electoral process and the democratic process. And as a result, the values that young people had or have in the United States, and I'd say across the world, were not being reflected in our political institutions. This generation, well, the generation at the time were millennials who were just coming of age to vote. Now it's Gen Z who's coming of age to vote. And the trends of both of these generations are the most diverse in at least American history, the most progressive in American history. But again, there is a barrier between this population and their ability to really have influence over the political process. So we started this organization to focus on young people between 17 and 35. We started off simply just trying to get young people out to vote. But as time went on, we realized that we need to do more than just turn young people out to vote. So we started doing advocacy campaigns because we realized that there are a number of laws in place that made it difficult for young people to vote. In the United States, you have to register before you vote. So we passed laws like online voter registration, same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, which circumnavigated that barrier. We also started focusing on a lot of civic education, making sure that people understood why it's important to vote, why participating in politics can have a direct impact on your day-to-day life as a citizen in the United States. And then we really started focusing on developing leaders, because we not only wanted young people to vote, We not only wanted young people to understand why it's important to vote, we didn't just want young people to advocate for what they wanted. We wanted young people to be the leaders in our society who are actually governing our institutions. And we've had extreme success since then. We've passed about 8 laws. We've graduated over 250 young people from our leadership development programs. Youth voter turnout in Chicago when the organization first started was the lowest amongst voting age populations. But in the 2020 election, as well as in the 2018 election, young people between 17 and 35 turned out at higher rates than everybody else. So we're definitely making an impact on the city by focusing our efforts on increasing the representation of youth. And as a result, we've been able to see a lot of great things happen in our city that do reflect the values of our generation. So.
Wow, amazing. 8 whole laws.
8 whole laws, yeah.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of laws.
It's a lot. I think my next question would be, and we were just talking before this DGCOM Innovation Talk started, that Stevie's actually been traveling around Europe for the past month, I would say. But obviously, you know, the political systems and the political realities that are underpinning both the context you operate in and the context we operate in are very different. What would you say have you learned throughout your work, but also your travels just now, that kind of transcends this context? So, like, what is true about young voters and, like, you know, youth mobilization kind of everywhere you've been?
Yeah, you know, I'd say that young voters everywhere I've been are pretty frustrated with the political systems that exist both in the United States and across the EU. I feel that a lot of young people feel that their voices are still not being represented accurately by the political institutions that exist, which has been really enlightening to me because, as you mentioned, the context of our political institutions is completely different, but also similar in a lot of ways. You know, young people are very interested in racial equity on both sides of the Atlantic. I think in my conversations here in the EU, a lot of folks are trying to uplift racial equity as like a major political issue that needs to be addressed. Issues like immigration. I feel that a lot of young people feel that politicians are not taking the steps that they would like to see them take as it relates to immigration, both in the U.S. and here. Environmental issues are also extremely important. And then there's issues that are extremely important to young people in the U.S. that are not really on the radar of young people here in the EU, and vice versa. But the passion and the sentiment still remains the same. You know, my driving interest in being here and traveling across the EU is to hear what young people care about, learn how these political institutions exist here, and hopefully build bridges between us, and so that we can work more collaboratively to strengthen our global democracy and our global political institutions. Because, you know, we all do exist on one planet, believe it or not. Whether there's a border or there isn't a border, like, we share this planet, and I think the last 3 years have like demonstrated that more than anything else, with the pandemic. And for me, what really like sparked a passion for me to come and travel around the world and learn from new people and like partner with new people was specifically the police shooting of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the United States, when, you know, we've been protesting things like this our entire lives. But I remember in 2020 seeing people in places like Paris and London and Brussels just take to the streets on behalf of an issue that directly impacts Black Americans. And that was nice. That was good to see. And it made me feel like maybe, you know, stepping outside of the U.S. bubble and building relationships with people across the globe will help all of us ultimately push our political institutions globally to be where we want them to be. So.
Okay, thank you. Then I want to, like, I think for my last question before we move to the Q&A, so if you haven't asked your question yet, do so now. On the Chicago Vote website and also in your first answer, there's a couple of words that seem to come back time and time again. So there's civic education, there's leadership development, there's voter turnout, and there's advocacy. And I feel like those were like 4 themes that I, as an outsider, could immediately see on your website. So what do they mean? What tactics are they? How do they relate to the work that Chicago Votes is doing?
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned in my introduction, or when I was talking about the organization to begin with, we feel that it is extremely important to approach politics with a holistic perspective. We've been hearing for years to vote, which you should vote, but voting doesn't solve everything. In order to actually reform political institutions, rebuild, reimagine political institutions, you have to approach them with a holistic, tactics. And these are our 4. Civic education. So in the U.S., our political system is rather complicated. I think since I've been in the EU, I do believe that ours is a little bit more complicated, despite the fact that we only have really 2 major political parties. We elect people on the federal level, we elect people on the state level, we elect people on the city level, and we have probably about 2 elections every year.
That's a lot.
Yeah, we have primary elections, we have general elections, and it is a lot. And in order for people to participate in these systems confidently, they need the civic education to participate in them. So for me, that's kind of like the first piece of the puzzle, is to civically educate people about how government works, why these elections matter, who these people are running for office, what office are they running for, how that's going to impact your life. The next piece of that puzzle is to develop young people into leaders through that civic education. Teaching youth, this is how government works, this is your role in it. You can be a leader by voting. You can be a leader by advocating. You can be a leader by running for office, starting your own NGO, protesting in the streets. And we want young people to do at least one, if not all of those things, because they all have a direct impact on how our political institutions exist. The next piece of it is voter turnout. When an elected official is elected, they're elected to represent the people who voted for them. And so ensuring that voter turnout is high amongst young people, and not just amongst young people, amongst marginalized communities in general, is very important to us, because we want to build institutions in the U.S., and I believe young people here in the EU also want to build institutions here that are equitable. And in order for them to be equitable, the voices of the most marginalized needs to be prioritized. And then the last piece of it is advocacy. Once these elected officials are put into office by the leaders who voted them into office, they voted them into office in a knowledgeable way because they're civically educated. It's important for us to hold them accountable to the things that they said they were going to do, but we also have to advocate for the things that we want them to do. One really important issue to us in the United States, or at least at my organization, is advocating for the voting rights of people who are currently incarcerated. Because in the U.S., we incarcerate 25% of the world's population, of the world's imprisoned population, even though we only make up 5% of the world's population. Over 50% of those people are black, and if they're not black, they're brown. If they're not brown, they're poor. And when you're sentenced to prison in the United States, you don't have your right to vote anymore. And in many states, once you've been convicted, even when you're released, you never get that right restored. And these are marginalized communities. So our major advocacy push, for example, right now, is to restore the right to vote to people in Illinois prisons, which is about 35,000 people. And by doing so, we feel like we can start to build a more equitable democracy, more equitable political institutions, because these people are being the most impacted by one of the most harmful systems that exist in the United States. And this is a youth-led advocacy effort that doesn't just impact youth, it impacts all people. It's just coming from the ideals of a new generation. And so I think that's why these 4 key components are important to us. You know, we have to be educated, we have to be leaders, we have to vote at a high rate, and then we have to advocate for things that reflect our ideals and our values so that we can create a society that is better, not just for us, but for generations that follow.
Okay. I'm going to allow myself one follow-up question.
Yeah, of course.
Before I move to the Q&A. So when you are building initiatives at Chicago Votes, and you've got these 4 core tactics, does that then mean that when you're building an initiative, you make sure that like those 4 tactics are always represented in the whole of the initiative? Or is it more, there's a voter turnout initiative, there's a leadership initiative, and then they kind of give like a larger picture?
So can I cuss on this, or should I not?
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe
All right. So I'll edit my language. We run 3 initiatives at Chicago Votes: Unlock Civics, Reimagining Democracy, and Give an S word.
Okay. Okay.
And so, under each of those initiatives, we run a bunch of different programs. Unlock Civics is our initiative that functions at the intersection of democracy and carceral institutions. We run programs that focus on voting while incarcerated, so those programs are specifically focused on voter turnout. We run programs centered around leadership development. So we train peer educators to teach civic education courses inside prisons. We also we hire people to be civic leaders who are formerly incarcerated. That program focuses on leadership development. We passed a law, actually, that requires prisons in Illinois to teach people who are being released from prison civic education courses as part of their reentry process. That program focuses on civic education. And then we passed a law that turned our jail into a polling location. It was the first jail in the United States to serve as a polling location for people incarcerated there. We passed a law, like I mentioned, to make sure people are taught civic education in prisons. And we're advocating for this law to give people in prison their right to vote. And that is advocacy. So under the Unlock Civics initiative, we have all of these different programs that focus on these core components. And the same goes for like our Reimagining Democracy program. We have similar breakdowns that focus on the different tactics of ours. The same goes for our Give an S word initiative that has a bunch of different programs that focus on different tactics, but all of them feed up to the core initiative, and so each initiative does touch each one of those tactics. So that's our complicated infrastructure.
No, I don't think it's that complicated. I could follow.
I've had a long time explaining it, so I've had a lot of practice.
All right, thank you so much. We'll now open the general Q&A. I see that there's already a couple of questions that came in. And I'm gonna start with the first one, and I think we can also show it on screen by Kaspar. Who wants to know, what does your youth leadership program look like? How do you motivate young people to move further in their engagement and the next step of their activism?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of different leadership development programs. I mentioned our civic leaders and our peer educator program. That's part of our Unlock Civics initiative. This leadership development program specifically focuses on young people or people in general who are currently or formerly incarcerated in the United States. We also have a program called Democracy Corps. This is a leadership development program tailored towards young people who come from marginalized communities, giving them the tools they need to engage their peers around elections. So these young people develop voter guides based off of issues that we know young people care about. And every election cycle, those voter guides are distributed digitally and physically to millions of youth across the city of Chicago, so they know who's on the ballot, what that office does, the stances of those candidates on the issues that matter to them most. We also, that Democracy Corps program also runs a program called Parades to the Polls, which is really cool. They work inside high schools and colleges as well as in the community and mobilize youth to go on marches through their community to cast their ballots. Under the Give a S Word initiative, this is our cultural organizing component, and we do a lot of leadership development for creatives, many grant programs to give young creatives the freedom to express their civic and political interests artistically. We pay young creatives to create clothing lines for our gas station, the Give a S Word station, where you can buy movement merchandise in Chicago for young fashion designers who want to participate in the political process. And we also have a creative collective for about 75 to 80 young Black and brown creatives in Chicago, ranging from saxophonists to tap dancers to culinary arts specialists, to singers, to rappers, to poets, who come together and just come up with creative ways to engage their peers civically. And so we have a number of other leadership development programs, but over the course of our 10 years, these programs have graduated over 250 leaders, and they've gone on, not only have they been successful in engaging their peers, using the tactics that we hand to them, they've been successful in coming up with new creative tactics based off of their lived experience, because everybody's an expert in their own lived experience. These creatives or these leaders have gone on to run and serve in public office, run their own NGOs, join our board of directors, join our team. And so we're building like a strong tradition and culture in the city of Chicago of engaging young Black and brown creatives, not only to participate in politics, but to create a political culture in the city that is more reflective of their ideals. And I think that's why it's successful, because we're not asking people to step out of their comfort zone and participate in a political system that is uncomfortable to them or foreign to them and not what they're used to. We're asking them to create the system with us, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
Okay, thank you. That was a great answer.
I'm a little biased, but...
Well, you'd have to be.
Yeah, I'd have to be.
All right, the next question is from Anna, who says, you mentioned voters need to keep their representatives accountable. How do you educate and encourage your communities to hold these representatives accountable?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, the voter guides that I mentioned earlier, that's one tactic that we use. We ask candidates their stances on issues that really matter to us, and we put their stances in writing. And we distribute those stances to millions of voters and all over the city. And a lot of times young people are turning out to vote for the candidates who took stances on issues that are more in line with their values. So that's one way. Just to get the candidates to take a stance on our issues before the election is really important. After the election, we do our advocacy work. You know, we come back to the state capitol, we go into City Hall, we go to the federal government, and we follow up on the issues and the stances that these candidates have taken, either by writing laws and advocating laws and trying to pass those laws and implementing those laws, or by asking the candidates to do that themselves or take public stances that are in line with our values. I think the key component is not to walk away after the election, to make sure we hold these candidates' feet to the fire, because they are going to have to run again. And if we're not careful, and we've seen this happen, candidates will get elected by taking stances on issues, not do anything for that issue the whole time they serve in office because nobody's there holding their feet to the fire, and come the next election season take that same stance in order to mobilize those same voters. So we're trying to keep people engaged, not just around election cycles, but all the way through the legislative season and beyond as well.
And that's, again, where beyond the voter turnout, the advocacy, the leadership development, and the civic education would come in, I assume.
Yes, exactly.
All right. I have one more question. I'm going to take Francesca's first, and I'll move on to Tommaso's. So Francesca wants to know, how about gender issues? Do you have any special programs for girls, young women? If yes, can you tell us more? Perhaps one addition from my side. If no, can you also explain why?
Yeah. We don't have a program right now that is specifically tailored towards gender issues. However, gender, race, socioeconomic status are things that highlight themselves at the intersection of all that we do. For example, Black women are the fastest growing population of incarcerated people in the United States. Most women in prison are mothers, and we prioritize uplifting those voices because we understand how important it is for people who exist at these intersections of marginalization, such as women, such as Black people, such as people who are incarcerated, voices to be prioritized in our political institutions. I'm also proud to say that our team is majority women, and so everything we do has that lens to it. My two co-directors are also women, but no, we do not have currently, as it stands, a program that is hyper-focused towards that, and that's not because we don't want to, and there hasn't been an explicit decision not to do that. We're still a growing organization. And right now, we just focus on making sure all that we do is positively impacting people who exist at those marginalized intersections based off of the programs that we currently run.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Tommaso, who wants to know, what is the role of social media in running and promoting your programs?
Yeah, big role.
Good.
Big role.
Sure, he's glad to hear it.
Big role. I don't know if any of you know this, but young people don't really watch the news.
Really?
I don't. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. But they do love social media, and that's where. Not even just young people. That's where a lot of people get most of their information. And so we use social media as a tactic, not only just for voter turnout, but for advocacy as well. We use it as an online organizing tactic. We use it as a civic education tactic. We use it for marketing. It's kind of the core of our outreach, especially during the pandemic. Traditionally in U.S. politics, and I don't know if this is the same in the EU, the core campaign tactics for reaching young people or reaching people in general, turning them out to vote, trying to get them to support a candidate or oppose a candidate, whatever, is to like pick up the phone and call them and go to their neighborhoods and knock on their doors. I'm not sure if that is a campaign tactic in
I've
the
never
EU.
knocked on a door.
Yeah, so
I'll be honest. I do have friends who have, but I have not knocked on a door.
In the U.S., that's like big.
Yeah.
But, you know, a lot of young people aren't trying to do that anymore, especially post-pandemic when we've all got really comfortable with being at home. And so we've really leaned deeply into like our online organizing and our online presence in general. You know, to mobilize people, to uplift the voices of young people. We've done a lot to boost our online journalism space. We do a lot of vlogs. We're producing a lot of podcasts now. Our social media following increases rapidly every year. We've used it to pass legislation we have this thing called witness slips that you have to secure, or you don't have to, but it helps when you're trying to pass a law, to get a bunch of people to fill out witness slips saying that they're in support of this law. And we've been able to far outweigh the opposition to any piece of legislation that we've moved through social media and getting young people to fill out witness slips before a bill goes to a committee hearing. And so we'll sit in a committee hearing and we'll have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in favor of something like voting in prison and like one person opposing it, because we're able to use that as a tactic to reach our base and mobilize people around issues that really matter to them, even beyond the election, which I think is like really exciting, getting people to take action on advocacy, even if they're not directly involved in writing the legislation, even if they can't go to Springfield, which is where our state capital is in Illinois. They could take action from home, which is extremely impactful and does have a direct impact on people's lives who are the most marginalized.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Magdalena, who's asking, in your experience, what is the best trigger for young people to get politically engaged? Is it a topic that matters to them? Is it youthful, understandable language? Is it like, a format that's more informal in which they feel more at home?
It's the last one.
Yeah.
Creating spaces that young people want to be in. As part of our Give an S-Word program, we have Give an S-Word happy hours, which are essentially parties. They're just civic-themed parties. So we'll have fashion shows that are all about getting out the vote. We'll have barbecues that are all about reimagining what a democracy could be. We'll have open mic nights that are all about divesting from the prison industrial complex and investing into our public education system. People will come to a happy hour. People will come to a barbecue. People will come to a fashion show, a concert. We throw concerts with like really well-known local artists, and young people turn out to that. And at those concerts, we'll like gather data on what they care about. And so that's a highly effective way to bring young people into the political space, is like creating a space that they want to be in. The other tactic is listening to young people. Just listen. Fair. Inquire about what it is that they care about, what issues impact them the most, what issues they want to see change in their society. Brainstorm with them about ways to address those issues. Just don't tell young people what to do. I don't know if there's many parents out there, but I'm sure you can relate to telling your kid what they should and shouldn't do, and they do exactly the opposite of what you're telling them to do. I mean, that's true for humans in general. So just inquire, get to know what issues make young people fired up, and work with them. Come up with ideas about ways to address those things, and don't discredit them before you have, or before giving them an opportunity to express their views on things. So.
Okay, glad to hear. I feel like what I've learned as a young person, still myself, but I've learned if there's free food, people will usually turn
also
up.
Free food, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you've got their attention.
People love some good pizza. I guess here in Brussels, it would be fries.
Fries, yeah, fries, waffles. Have you had the fries yet? Or?
I haven't had the fries yet.
Okay.
But
I'll give you some
I'm hungry now, so I think I'll go afterwards.
I'll give you some recommendations after. All right, but we do have a couple of more questions still. Oliver wants to know, how do you approach people? Like, where do you meet them in order to communicate with them?
I think we always say we meet people where they are. Physically speaking, we run programs in, I like to say 3 main institutional buckets. Our carceral institutions, so we work inside jails, we work inside prisons, and we work inside juvenile detention centers, which are child prisons in the United States. We work inside educational institutions, so we're in middle schools, actually. Even though middle schoolers aren't voting age populations, we do a civics curriculum inside middle schools, teaching young people how to track the legislative process, because even if you're in middle school, you can still influence your lawmaker. You can still pick up the phone and ask a lawmaker to vote for something that you want them to vote for. We work inside high schools. We work inside colleges. We meet people just in the community. We set up tables at community events. We will set up tables at high traffic intersections in Chicago. We will hop on public transit and walk through the trains, passing out voter guides to young people who are on the trains. We also work in the creative space. So, we do stuff with creatives. We create space for creatives to do stuff at our organization. We throw parties in prominent clubs. And then we're on social media. And we are very effective with the tactics we use to engage different audiences on social media. For example, we have very specific targeted wards in Chicago that we really want to try to increase youth voter turnout in, because these are the wards that have the most young people living in them and the lowest youth voter turnout. And so even on our social media, we'll hyper target our outreach to specific zip codes. And so, yeah, we're basically everywhere. We're everywhere anyone's at, and we engage them in any way that we can. That's my short answer for that.
Perfect, thank you. I want to pull a different question slightly ahead because I think it flows better. So Harris actually asked, and I think that dovetails really nicely, is can you provide a few ideas as to how to approach a difficult, I'm assuming he means more marginalized group of young voters? We find here within the European Parliament that initial contact is invariably the trickiest one.
Right. You gotta just be in community with these folks. You know what I mean? The reason we were able to pass the law to turn the jail into a polling location is because we were in the jail all the time, registering voters inside the jail, asking people in the jail what they care about. Like I said earlier, inquiring with them about the impacts or the things in their community that they want to see change. And brainstorming with them about ways to see that change. And as a result of that constant interaction with people in jail, we were able to write, advocate for, and pass a law to turn the jail into a polling location. And it was a law that reflected the ideals and the perspectives of people directly impacted by it. The same thing happened in the prison. When we were able to pass this law to bring civics to the prison, we were partnering with a professor there, Dr. Christina Rivers, and DePaul University, doing a think tank in the prison and hearing from people in prison what they needed to feel more civically engaged. And so the same goes for being in these high schools, being in these colleges, being in these communities. You really do have to be in community with people. You can't just show up to where marginalized communities are and ask them to vote. They're not going to listen to you because you aren't a part of their lived experience. You aren't a part of their life. You're not a trusted advocate. So you have to just be in community with people long term in order to ultimately get them to feel that they should civically engage in the way that you feel that they should. And again, you have to just learn from folks. I think sometimes we as people who are inside of the political bubble feel like it's our job to just teach people what they should do and tell people what they should do and come up with gimmicks to get people to do them. But good old-fashioned friendship and community building is ultimately how you're going to change anything. So that would be my advice.
So you got to show up and show up again.
You got to show up and show up again and be there consistently. And I'll say that's the nice thing about being a part of an NGO as opposed to being a part of a campaign. Having worked on a number of political campaigns, one of the hardest things for me was building these strong relationships with volunteers and building this culture of turnout with the people who are in these communities that we want to vote. And then once the election is over, leaving. It always broke my heart. Yeah. But being a part of an organization is really impactful because it means you could be there long term. And we've proven that, as a youth-led organization, we've been around for 10 years and now we're intergenerational. And as a result, we have more trust in the community and we have more trust in the legislative body. And we've been able to, because of that, pass all of these laws. We've been able to mobilize all of these young voters. We've been able to develop all of these leaders. And we're starting to build the counterculture to what has always existed in politics as a result of us constantly being there as a staple in the community.
Okay, thank you. I'll take Annette's question next, since she's been waiting for a bit, I think. So Annette would like to know where or who do you get your funding from? So how do you fund these programs?
So we have 4 major funding sources. Private institutions or foundations. That's our biggest funding source. So like grants. We have a number of large supporters back in the U.S., the Kellogg Foundation, the Joyce Foundation, the Vocal Fund, Field Fund, the Chicago Community Trust. I'm giving them all shout outs so they continue to fund us. Michael Jordan funds us, which is really cool, in the Jordan brand. I still haven't met him, so if he watches this, I hope I meet you.
Michael.
Air Jordan. We also get funding from businesses. Most businesses in-kind donations to us, so they'll give us free venues, they'll give us free food. We also have labor unions who support our work, and that is specifically for us to help turn out young workers to vote and engage them civically, because it's really important to engage young workers. And we also have individual funding programs. We have an individual funding program called The Click, and it's a sustainable giving program. You can give as little as $5 a month, or you can give like $10 a quarter. You can give $20 a year. So we fund it through a bunch of different mechanisms. And that's not just to get the money. That is to also build a community around our funding entities. You know, we want the people who are providing financial resources to the organization to be diverse and from a bunch of different lived experiences that reflect the lived experiences of the people that we're trying to engage. And ultimately, that just builds our movement out to be even bigger. So.
Okay, thank you. I quickly want to mention, Laura was trying to wake my computer up, so I accidentally ended up deleting your question. So if you could just, I kind of remember it, but if you could just maybe post it again, I apologize. So while Laura gets going on that, one more question that I can see from Mark, who says, time has a huge impact between generations, so it's 18-20 years. In terms of political engagement, are we dealing with a system where a minority decides for a majority?
So currently, are we dealing with a system where a small number of people are dictating our institutions? Mm-hmm. My subjective opinion is yes. I think that's kind of how it's always been, though, especially, I could speak for the U.S. I mean, our Constitution in the United States is the longest existing Constitution, I believe, in the world. We have the longest current Constitution. That Constitution was written by white men who owned property, majority slave owners. And in some of those states, you had to also be a Christian. So from that perspective, our political system has always been built for the minority to determine the existence for the majority. And we've constantly, the majority, like black people, brown people, women, marginalized people, have constantly been chipping away in the U.S. at that system in order to have our voices more represented. So to answer your question, yes, I believe that is the case. I also believe that's always been the case. And I also believe that it won't forever be the case because of work like what we're doing in Chicago to bring more people into the fold beyond just election season. You know, a lot of times people from marginalized communities are only talked to when it's time for them to vote. And we're trying to consistently talk to folks so that it isn't just the minority dictating the existence of the majority or creating the institutions for the majority. And that is reflected in our politics in Chicago and Illinois. We have, regardless of the political ideology, and some of these folks I don't always agree with, but in terms of racial and gender representation, that's showing up in Chicago. We have a black woman who's mayor, a black woman who is the state's attorney. We have a black woman who's lieutenant governor. We have a black woman who's the Cook County president, Cook County board president. A black man is our Speaker of the House. And all of these things are first in history, and they've all happened within like the last decade. And so I think that's really powerful, and I think that is showing you that as our generations are becoming more diverse, as more young people are becoming more politically active, the representation, whether it be racial or otherwise, is starting to be there. And eventually we're looking forward to a time in which the ideals of the majority determine what our existence actually is. And the Roe v. Wade decision is a perfect example of that. You know, a majority of the United States did not support the striking down of Roe v. Wade.
I'm very quickly going to explain that Roe v. Wade
sorry,
was a Supreme Court decision that laid down the right to abortion federally across the United States.
Thank you. I forgot that. But that's a perfect example of the minority determining the realities for the majority. And so, yeah, that's always been a problem in our country's history, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that here in the EU.
Okay, thank you. I saw we got Laura's question back. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Or Elena, I think, in the back who did this. Laura wants to know, in 2024, there will be European elections, but also presidential elections in the United States. Are there bridges we can build, projects that we can do together?
I'm excited for this question because it's one of the main reasons that I'm here in Europe, is trying to build relationships with folks so that we can partner together ahead of those 2024 elections. I know that my interest is to host young people in the United States to experience our elections state to state during the fall, and also to bring a group from the U.S. to experience the elections here during, I believe they'll be in the spring. Is that right, in 2024?
The European elections?
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
EU
usually
elections.
around May, yeah.
So I know I want to do like physical cultural exchanges. I think that would be a really neat opportunity. But even beyond that, I think getting aligned on some like core global ideals that we can start holding our candidates who are running for office in the U.S. and in the EU accountable to, that we can agree to as young people across the Atlantic, I think will be extremely powerful, especially young people across the Atlantic trying to advocate and center marginalized communities. Again, the democracy, the global stake of democracy is a global thing. And I think that I think elections are a perfect time to spark kind of that work together. But I also would like to see it beyond just the election cycle. Again, I think that if we continue to collaborate around advocacy initiatives, we can start to see a lot of good things happen in both of our regions, even between election cycles, to advance, some of these core ideals that represent the values of a younger generation, and start to make life better for marginalized communities, both in the EU and in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Those are all questions that we have from the audience at the moment. I see that Mark and Harris are still showing up on the screen, but we already got to those. So in case you do still have a question, now's your very, very last chance to still post it onto Slido. But while we're waiting for that, I actually do still have a question personally for you as well. And since I am moderating, I get to steal that spotlight for a second.
Okay.
So obviously, as the European Parliament, we are a public institution. We're not an NGO. We're not a pressure group. We can't really lobby anyone either. But I'm assuming, or I'm pretty sure that in your work, you have also worked with public institutions like ours before. As a civil society organization, so as an NGO, what kind of support do you actually need from institutions like ours to do your work?
Oh, wow. That's a very good question. I think that intentional prioritization of marginalized people, a definitive stance, clear identification of who those marginalized people are and the issues that they're dealing with, and an initiative by these institutions to work with groups like ours to figure out solutions to positively impact the lives of those marginalized people, of marginalized people. You know, that could look a bunch of different ways. You know, systemically, that's probably going to take some time to kind of like flesh out, but I think that the key is prioritizing people who need the most help, especially as like legislative lawmaking, powerful institutions who have a direct impact on people's lives. I know in the U.S., a lot of times what we hear is these people don't vote. But it's hard to participate in politics when you have a difficult life, when you are existing on the margins. You have other things that you need to deal with. You have mental health that you need to deal with. You're trying to get food on your tables. You're trying to make sure your kids are in a good school. You're trying to make sure you have quality health care, which are not things that we're entitled to in the United States. And so to only prioritize people who vote isn't fair, because a lot of people aren't voting and a lot of people aren't participating because they are not getting what they need from our institutions to begin with, and it's causing them to lack the capacity to participate politically. So just being proactive in identifying who needs help and being proactive in working with the people who can identify how to help those folks, I think that's a perfect way to lean in. I was just at a conference last week in Molina, and I heard from a number of different folks who their local governments, I believe Serbia is an example, anytime a piece of legislation is being proposed, an impact report on young people is being produced and taken into consideration before it's signed into law. I think that is an effective measure. I think anything that is ever being proposed as a piece of legislation, there should be an impact report, not only just on young people, but on marginalized communities in general, so that everything we do has an equitable lens on it. Global equity in our political institutions would be a beautiful thing, and it requires our political institutions to take the initiative to try to establish that.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question from the audience, which is perfect because then we're right on time for closing. And so it's Laura. It's a really nice last question as well.
Yeah.
So Laura's saying, back home, there's many who say, my vote has no impact. Nothing will ever change. It's the same old establishment. What will you say to these people? Why should they go out anyway?
I mean, that's a fair thing to say. I can understand why somebody would feel that way. I disagree, personally. I think that your vote does have an impact. I think you not voting has an even bigger impact. But again, it gets back to my original, the theme of this whole dialogue. Voting is one piece of the puzzle. You have to vote. You have to stick around to hold the people voting into office accountable. You have to advocate for what you want to see. The reality is participating in politics, participating in civics is not easy. It's not as easy as voting one time, then walking away and going home. You have to consistently be engaged. And so we are asking a lot of the young person who posed this question to you. And we just got to be real about that. Like, yeah, maybe like your vote is important. You not voting does have an impact. But to see the change you really want to see, you have to do way more than just vote. You have to be political every day. And it's a challenge to folks, but we need to pose that challenge and just keep it real about what that challenge actually is, and hopefully empower them through civic education, through development, to continue to participate. And then, again, just try to create spaces where they want to participate, create a space where they feel like going to this institution, going into this space is not only going to be fun and welcoming, we're going to have a positive impact on real people's lives. And so it's worth being a part of.
It's the hard and necessary work of politics.
The hard and necessary work of politics.
All right.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we have. What I take with me from this talk is be honest, listen, show up, build community, throw a party every once in a while.
Party. Bring some free food.
And we'll bring those young people to the table and we'll mobilize them to vote. Thank you so much, Stevie, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I hope it was as inspiring to the people listening as it was to me in this room. I think generally there will be a short evaluation survey that will be sent your way. So in case you want to fill this out and give us some feedback on this DG.com Innovation Talk or propose a topic for the next DG.com Innovation Talk, we'd always be happy to hear. Thank you so much. I think that's it from our side. Do you have any last words?
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much.
Appreciate y'all. Bye.
Bye.